is it becomes very vague. So, you can say, yes, formative assessment has theoretical underpinnings in Vygotskian psychology and sociocultural psychology, without ever saying what you mean by formative assessment. And, so it's kind of like it's a warrant without something to attach the warrant to. So for me, that's the most critical theoretical issue.
Firstly, I would like to thank you for a very, very illuminating discussion on a critical review of the formative assessment. Just one question. You talked about domain analysis and only the cognitive domain analysis that you're doing in this, that is being done. The example that you gave, I was just thinking that when the child is forming concepts, when he's construing it in his mind, isn't the affective domain also plays a part? Do we take that into account, the attitudes, his values? So do we do a domain analysis for?
I'm not sure that you do a domain analysis, but in a domain analysis, you might want to include affective issues. So, for example, or affective considerations. So, for example, an appreciation of mathematics, a positive attitude toward mathematics. And you might want to, as part of classroom assessment or formative assessment, consider those affective attitudes. Yeah, I think that's important.
Hi, I'm May from University of London. I have a question about, you mentioned about KLT, keeping learning on track, as lending clarity to the definition or making formative assessment more concrete. I have a question about KLT because I sometimes feel that teachers carry out KLT or the strategies more like a roadmap or as strategies, as techniques, and it therefore degenerates into a sequence of steps I have to take, which I feel sometimes undermine the spirit of formative assessment, which, if I'm not wrong, at the end of the day, it is about students learning. What are your views on that?
Yeah, I think I tried to communicate that I thought KLT had the potential to do just what you say. So to the extent that you as a teacher don't have a real good understanding of the subject you're teaching, these strategies are not going to do a whole lot. They're going to be exactly how you describe, a set of steps that you run through and that really don't have much impact other than to give you the sense that you're doing something structured and orderly. Because you're not going to be able to use them to maximum effect if you don't know deeply the domain that you're teaching.
Could I ask, I really like the idea of well-designed tests being, well-designed assessments being possible to be both formative and summative. Have you seen any examples of such well-designed assessments that do fulfill both those requirements?
Yeah, well, what I suggested was that I thought it was possible to design summative tests that had a secondary formative use. And by secondary, I meant that at the best, what they would do was point teachers to areas of concern that they themselves would have to follow up upon. So I have seen tests like that, but I don't think that it's reasonable to expect a test to do both things well. It's kind of like, a good analogy is the Swiss Army knife. Does a lot of things, but you'd never choose it to do any one thing in particular if you had the option. So for example, if you were carving a turkey, you'd use a turkey knife. If you were building a house, you'd use an electric screwdriver. So, it comes handy in a pinch. It does a lot of things, but nothing well. And the same thing occurs, I think, if you try to optimize tests to multiple purposes. You can do one thing well, and maybe you can do a second thing, not too badly. And that's what I think one could do if one were careful in design with respect to summative tests that give some type of formative information, but that don't substitute for a formative assessment process and methodology in the classroom. Well, yeah. So, for example, there are writing assessments now that are done online, and they're also scored online. And part of so not only does a score come back, but also a fairly detailed analysis of the kinds of problems that appeared in that student's response. Typically lower level problems like grammatical errors, spelling errors, lack of paragraphing, so some structural sorts of things, too many repetitions of particular words, stuff like that. So that can be formative if the teacher and student know how to use it in that way.
I would be interested in knowing about the teacher and student ratio in the classroom. What research says about the effectivity, what is the ideal people-teacher ratio in classroom if you will go for a big way throughout the country. Because most of the studies talk about a particular classroom situation or experimental studies. They are talking about the effectivity about those control conditions. So in general, what may be what is your opinion about it?
Could you say a little more? Because I'm not sure that I got the essence of your question.
Actually, my question is people-teacher ratio in a classroom. A classroom of 70 students, 20 students, 30 students, and a teacher. What research says about it?
So is the question, how does a teacher deal with the fact of having so many kids in the classroom for purposes of doing an assessment that gives information for an individual?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's very difficult. I mean, that's one of the reasons why formative assessment is a real challenge, because teachers don't have the time to work individually with students. Now, part of what Dylan William was trying to do in that set of techniques he developed for KLT was to provide techniques that would be useful in those situations. So, the idea of giving students colored cups, at one level, that's a very sensible thing to do, because if you're teaching about some mathematical concept and you ask students, okay, give us the story about your current state of understanding, and you see a lot of yellow and red cups, you know that you probably shouldn't go on. You probably should say more about this concept, perhaps from a different point of view. So I think there are approaches one could take that may be oriented more toward the group than toward the individual. And, he has a fair number of them. But again, it's got to be combined with a real understanding of what it is, of the subject matter being taught. It can't simply be the techniques.
What do you see as the most urgent issues for further research in formative assessment?
Yeah, I guess I think everything begins with definition. So, right now, you may all know of other instances of formative assessment that have a theory of action and that have something concrete that you can look at and leaf through. I don't know of a lot of things like that. So if you know of other things like KLT, that would be important to know about, and for others to begin looking at the effectiveness of, looking at the characteristics of, looking at the functioning of. So I think that's really a fundamental place to start, to to have a concrete instance and a theory of action that describes how that concrete instance is supposed to work. And the most important thing is, how is that formative assessment supposed to cause learning? What are teachers supposed to do? What are students supposed to do? And once that's all laid out, then the question is, do they actually do that? And if they do actually do that, does that in fact result in learning that is greater than they're doing something else that they could do in that same period of time?
Just a short question. Thank you for excellent presentation. It was very interesting. My question is one of purposes of formative assessment is observation for the growth of child from one grade to another grade, and if so, the second question is how can we provide vertical equation, because you advise to use different procedures, not just tests like observation and maybe portfolio and other procedures. And do you maybe know papers or articles where we can read about measurement instruments for providing vertical equation?
For vertical
Equation,
equating?
yeah, equating. Maybe you can.
Yeah. Well, it's a good question, because I think it in part illustrates some of the confusion about what formative assessment is. If you look at the people who take the process point of view, there are no scores, there are no forms, there is nothing to be equated, horizontally or vertically. From their point of view, the purpose of formative assessment is to allow teachers, sometimes in real time, to make decisions about what students know so that they can change instruction and thereby impact learning. Okay, so that's a sort of a brief encapsulation of the process point of view. Now, there's also, as I mentioned, on another extreme, there's an instrument view. And, there are people who routinely talk about formative assessment as a test and who sell formative tests. And for them, there are issues of scoring, scaling, equating. So it sort of depends from what point of view you come at this.
Well, I think if there's no question, it's lunchtime. It's my honor to present this small gift from the organizing committee to Randy. And I'd like to express how much I enjoy this lecture and the discussion afterwards. This is a tie so that you can remember this conference by. And again, the lunch is upstairs on the third floor.